What if your mother tongue wasn't born anywhere near your homeland? What if every sentence you speak echoed from a people your ancestors never met? Not a borrowed phrase, not a cultural trend, but the entire language carried from 4,000 kilometres away. And no one ever told you. That's the Finnish paradox. The Finnish language doesn't belong to any of its neighbours. It's not Indo-European like Swedish, Russian or Latvian. It's Uralic, part of a strange, isolated family of languages that stretches from the icy shores of Norway to the reindeer camps of Siberia. Now here's the twist. Modern DNA studies, like the 2018 Lamnidis et al. Analysis and the 2025 genome-wide breakdown by Zhang and colleagues, show something shocking. The Finnish people are almost entirely European in their genes. From the ancient Western hunter-gatherers who settled Finland after the Ice Age, to the Indo-European steppe migrations from the corded ware culture around 3200 BC. The Finnish genome matches the continent's history. Only a small fraction, about 10 to 13%, comes from Siberia. And yet Finnish isn't European in its roots. It shares ancestry with the languages of the Nganasan in Siberia, the Mansi of the Ural Mountains, and even the distant Samoyedic speakers near the Arctic coast. So here's the contradiction. How can a language travel so far when the people who spoke it didn't? For decades, linguists guessed that Proto-Uralic originated somewhere near the Ural Mountains, a convenient middle point. But the latest genetic reconstructions don't agree. They point to a homeland much farther east, near Yakutia, a place of permafrost, frozen graves, and Bronze Age secrets buried beneath the ice. And the DNA found there, from Yakutia LNBA individuals, shows a perfect match to the ancient genetic core of all Uralic-speaking peoples. So now the question shifts. If the Uralic homeland truly lies in the icy forests of Siberia, then what force carried its voice all the way to the lakes of Finland? And why? Did it survive when its people did not? We're just getting started. But what if the people who first lived in Finland never spoke a word of that language at all? Because before the Siberian voice arrived, this land already had its own people, and their story begins in silence. Roughly 11,000 years ago, as the Ice Age slowly released its grip, the first humans stepped into what is now Finland. These weren't settlers, they were survivors, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, following the retreating glaciers, tracking game across newly exposed tundra. Archaeologists call them the Kunda culture, and their tools, flint blades, bone hooks, antler harpoons, have been found across southern Finland, especially near Ristola. These people didn't farm, they didn't build kingdoms, they lived in pine shelters, followed the rhythms of reindeer herds, and fished in the icy rivers. But here's where science brings them back to life. Modern genetic testing of ancient remains shows that mitochondrial DNA, haplogroup U5b, passed down through mothers, was dominant among these early Finns, and it still exists today in over 25% of modern Finnish women. That's a direct biological line, stretching back over 9,000 years. The bones confirm it, the genes confirm it. This was the first foundation of Finnish DNA. But there's one thing these people left no trace of: language. They didn't speak Finnish. They didn't speak Uralic. There's no connection to Siberia, not in their culture, not in their graves, not in their blood. Their language, whatever it was, is gone. No inscriptions, no carvings, just wind and snow where their words used to be. And for thousands of years, that silence held. Until around 4200 BC, when something strange began to appear along Finland's shores. Rows of handmade pottery, pressed with tiny comb-like patterns, drifting in from the east, and with them, a new voice began to whisper. But here's the twist. Those pots weren't just containers. They carried a language, one that didn't belong to Europe at all. Because when archaeologists first uncovered the strange patterned ceramics across Finland, what they called pitcomb ware, they thought it was just a new style. But they were wrong. These weren't just pots. They were footprints. The earliest markers of a completely new cultural identity, one that didn't come from the West, but from deep within Siberia. This pottery first appears around 4200 BC, moving westward through the forests, over rivers, into the lakes and coasts of Finland. And with it came more than design. It came with beliefs, with rituals, with words. Linguists now believe this was the first archaeological signature of Proto-Uralic. The language that would one day evolve into Finnish, Sami, Estonian, was now arriving in physical form. And there's more. Linguistic reconstruction, using shared words across modern Uralic languages, reveals something striking. Ancient vocabulary for boreal ecology, the word for fir tree, njoke, words for reindeer, snowshoe, pine resin. These don't match Western Europe. They match Siberia, specifically the taiga zone, from the Ural Mountains to the Lena River Basin. This means the people behind the combware culture weren't local. They were forager hunters, who had come from the east, maybe not many, maybe only a few, but their language took root, and Finland would never sound the same again. Because this wasn't just cultural diffusion. This was linguistic transformation without invasion. We don't know their names, but we know their fingerprints in the pottery, in other words, in the sound of modern Finnish. But here's the part no one expected. These quiet foragers were only the first wave. Behind them, just a few centuries later, came a people who didn't just carry pots. They carried bronze weapons, new technologies, and a powerful genetic signal that would reshape the North forever. Because in this part of history, language didn't arrive with war. It arrived glowing, molten, carried by men who shaped the future with fire. Sometime around 2000 BC, a strange wave began rippling west across Eurasia, not with banners, not with armies, but with bronze, weapons, ornaments, chisels, crafted by people who left no empire behind, but changed everything in their path. This was the Sema Tobino phenomenon, a cultural explosion that began in the Altai Mountains and rolled west across Siberia all the way into Fennoscandia. Fast, mysterious, and without a single known homeland. But here's the twist. Behind those bronze tools was DNA. In 2025, a groundbreaking study confirmed the arrival of Yakutia LNB ancestry, a genetic signature first found in the Middle-Late Bronze Age graves of Yakutia, and suddenly it appeared in ancient remains from Finland, Estonia and beyond. It was faint, just a few percent, but unmistakable. And that same Siberian ancestry is now found, in different doses, across every Uralic-speaking population today, from the Sami of Lapland to the Mari of the Volga to the Mansi in western Siberia. One genetic signal, threading a language family across 4,000 kilometers. But how? How did these bronze smiths and forest herders spread a language without a conquest? Artifacts help fill the silence. Bronze celts found in Finnish burial sites near Kyukainen and Ilikiminki are almost identical to those uncovered in Sian and Trans-Uralic regions. The style, the metal, the shape, twins, thousands of miles apart. This wasn't cultural influence. This was a shared identity. But that raises a deeper mystery. If just a small group brought the bronze and just a trace of DNA remains, then why did their language echo louder than their blood? Because buried inside those genes, inside that tiny thread of Yakutian ancestry, is a secret far more enduring than bronze. It was passed not just through tools, but through bloodlines. What if your last name, your family line, the face in your grandfather's photograph, all pointed back to Siberia? Because hidden in the Y chromosomes of most Finnish men today, there's a code, a legacy, a thread that winds east, much farther than most would ever guess. It's called Y-DNA haplogroup N1C, and it's not just common, it dominates. 60 to 70% of Finnish men today carry this marker. And it doesn't come from Sweden, or the Baltic, or even the Ural Mountains. It comes from northeastern Siberia. This lineage likely began 12,000 to 14,000 years ago, deep in the frozen forests near the Yana River basin. For millennia it stayed east, isolated among reindeer herders, ice fishermen, mobile clans. But then something changed. By 1500 BC, we start to see it in the ancient remains of northern Fennoscandia. And not randomly, not evenly. In the northeast, subclade N101 appears strong. In the southwest, another branch, CTS 2929, shows up later but rises fast. 2 waves, 2 entries, 2 stories merging. But this wasn't a full-blown migration. It wasn't war. The bones don't show battles. What we see is something subtler and more lasting. This is elite dominance, a few powerful male lines, spreading not through armies, but through generations, through alliances, through marriage, through sons. Their genetic imprint didn't flood the population, it pierced it, and then echoed forward. Even today, that Y chromosome, that Siberian marker, lives inside the veins of most Finnish men, fathers passing to sons, names passed down, legacies locked in chromosomes. But here's where it splits. Because when scientists checked the mitochondrial DNA, the line passed down through mothers, they found a surprise. Most of it still traces back to Europe. So if the fathers came from Siberia but the mothers were always here, what happened when these 2 lineages met? And why? Does the Finnish genome still whisper both stories at once? Because when 2 worlds collide, one ancient, one foreign, their echoes don't just blend in language, they sink deeper, into the blood, into the marrow, into the illnesses no one ever asked to inherit. The meeting of Siberian fathers and European mothers didn't just leave behind a cultural fusion. It carved a medical signature, one so unique, so isolated, that it turned Finland into a genetic island. It's called the Finnish disease heritage, and it's one of the strangest biomedical phenomena in the Western world. More than 30 inherited disorders. Some so rare they barely exist outside Finland's borders. Others almost mythical, like aspartyl glucosaminuria, or the terrifying congenital nephrotic syndrome of the Finnish type, NPHS1. But these aren't just medical curiosities, they are ancestral warnings, signposts of deep genetic bottlenecks. The first, nearly 4,000 years ago, as new groups from the east began to settle and merge. The second, during the Middle Ages, when wars, plagues and isolation shattered inland communities into silence. And what emerged was a wall, a genetic divide still visible today, running northwest to southeast across the country. On one side, Western Finns, genetically blended with Swedes, Balts and wider Europe. Fewer bottlenecks, less drift. On the other, Eastern Finns, especially in North Karelia, Savo and Lapland, high genetic drift, rare alleles, and the full weight of the Finnish disease heritage. It's like walking through a house and hearing two different histories in each room, same roof, same land, different origins. But the eastern rooms, the quietest ones, hold something else. Because behind those alleles, behind the drift and disease, lies a population even older than Finnish, identity itself, one that never fully left, one whose footprints still linger beneath the pine needles and snow, waiting to be seen. In the DNA of the Sami, because the Sami, the reindeer herders of the Arctic Circle, didn't always live in the north. Once they ruled the forests of southern Finland, before history pushed them into the snow. When most people picture the Sami, they imagine Lapland, frozen tundra, reindeer migrations under the northern lights, but ancient DNA tells a different story, one buried not in the far north, but beneath the pine-covered hills of southern Finland. A study published in Nature in 2021, analysing Iron Age genomes from central Finland, revealed a stunning connection. These ancient individuals, some buried in forested burial mounds, some near rivers now lost to time, carried Saami-like ancestry, not just a little, substantial amounts. That means, before the arrival of Proto-Finnic speakers, the Sami were here, in Hemi, in central Ostrobothnia, even touching the southern coastlines. This wasn't a fringe population, it was a foundation. Their culture left traces. Joik singing passed through oral memory, shamanic burial rites with antlers placed over skulls, reindeer symbolism long before commercial herding began. But over time, these echoes were buried under new languages, new beliefs, new borders. Today, most Sami live hundreds of kilometres north, but their genetic shadow still clings to the trees. According to genome-wide studies, modern Finns, especially in central regions, carry between 5 and 10% Sami-related DNA. Not as a foreign presence, but as a forgotten ancestor. The blood remembers, even when names vanish. But here's the tragedy. The Sami didn't vanish in silence. They were pushed, assimilated, rewritten, slowly erased by centuries of settlement, taxation and religious conversion. And what makes it even more painful? They weren't alone, because somewhere in that vanishing rose a twin identity, a sibling culture that forgot its own name, and now calls itself Finnish. But what if your closest linguistic cousin didn't carry your blood? Finns and Estonians, two nations, one language branch, both speaking Finnic tongues shaped by the same ancestral grammar, similar sounds, similar roots. But deep beneath the syllables, the story splits, because while modern Finns carry about 10 to 13% Siberian ancestry, Estonians, just across the Gulf of Finland, have only around 2%, barely a shadow. Same language family, different genomes. And that's not a mistake. It's a clue. The Estonians didn't arrive with the Uralic wave. They adopted the language later, a cultural inheritance, not a genetic one. According to genetic studies from the Estonian Biocentre and published datasets in 2022, Estonians show far more genetic continuity with their Baltic and Slavic neighbours than with Uralic-speaking Siberian. Populations their paternal haplogroups are dominated by R1a and I1, not the Eastern N1c that marks Finnish and Sami males. In short, the Estonians speak a Uralic language, but they don't carry Uralic blood. This is a language shift, not a population movement. Meanwhile, in Finland, the language and the DNA walk hand in hand. The Siberian signal is stronger. The Bronze Era ancestry still whispers in male lineages. The mitochondrial heritage shows ancient contact zones. One adopted the tongue, the other inherited it from their bones, and between them a cultural mirror, shaped by borders, by neighbours, by centuries of trade and conflict. Estonia exposed to Baltic, Germanic and Slavic spheres, blended outward. Finland, isolated by the Baltic Sea and frozen terrain, turned inward. Preserved what others lost, mutated but never severed. And yet, if two peoples can share a language but not a history, then what truly makes a homeland? Because underneath every migration, every tongue, lies a deeper question that still has no answer. Where did the Uralic story really begin? For nearly a century, scholars stared west, to the Volga, to the Urals, convinced that's where the Uralic story began. But they were wrong, because the real homeland was buried under ice, thousands of kilometres to the east. Until recently, the most accepted theory placed Proto-Uralic, the ancient root language, somewhere near the Volga River, between Europe and Asia. A tidy halfway point, safe, reasonable. But then the bones began to speak. In 2025, a massive DNA synthesis study led by Zheng et al. Rewrote everything. They traced Uralic-speaking populations back not to the Volga, but to Yakutia, a place few had dared to connect with European languages, a place of frozen earth, reindeer trails, and rivers sealed in ice. The study showed that Proto-Uralic likely emerged around 2500 BCE, not near modern Russia's heartland, but deep in eastern Siberia, along the Lena River basin, where winters stretch for 9 months, and even language freezes in the air. And the language itself holds the proof. Reconstructed words from the earliest Uralic vocabulary, for pine, snowshoes, birch bark and reindeer, align precisely with the ecology of Yakutia, not the forests of the Volga. So what drove them west? It may have been the 4.2 kiloyear event, a massive climatic shock around 2200 BCE that dried rivers, shattered food systems, and sent entire cultures scattering like leaves in a storm. In the chaos, some moved south, others disappeared, but the Uralic ancestors moved west, not in conquest, not in mass migration, but in quiet waves, carrying stories carved into wood, memory shaped into myth. And when they arrived, they didn't build cities, they didn't raise armies, but somehow they rewrote the sound of an entire continent. Because what if your ancestors vanished, but their grammar still walked the earth? You see, the Uralic expansion didn't come with conquest. No iron-tipped arrows, no roaring chariots, just sound, language, ideas that spread faster than the people who spoke them. The turning point was the rise of the Sema-Tubino phenomenon between 2000 and 1500 BCE. Not an empire, but a movement, technologically advanced, mobile, and dangerously efficient. Their secret weapon wasn't just bronze, it was networking. Alliances across hunter-gatherer zones, traders reaching thousands of kilometres, from the Altai to the Baltics, and along those paths travelled Uralic tongues. But here's the twist. This wasn't elite dominance like Indo-European expansions. The genetic record doesn't show overwhelming male bias, no sharp flood of paternal Y-DNA, no sudden replacement. Instead, we see slow diffusion. Words spread faster than DNA. Language became a lingua franca for frontier farmers, scattered clans, and reindeer-bound foragers who shared no blood, but a need to understand each other. Finnish identity wasn't born in a single moment. It wasn't forged in war. It grew in layers, from whispers carried in wind, from quiet trade routes, from the way you name a river or call for help in the dark. And today, in modern Finland, that legacy survives. But here's what no one expects. There's one Uralic language still spoken, fluently, that carries the full syntax, the phonetics, the spirit, but almost none of the original genes. Not 10%, not even 2%, because somewhere far from the Arctic pines and Baltic shores, a tongue still breathes, but the people who once made it live are gone. And to find that ghost language, we have to go even further west. So what happens when a language survives, but the people behind it don't? Welcome to Hungary, a land where horses once thundered across the steppes, where the Danube winds like a ribbon through medieval stone, and where no trace of Siberian blood remains. And yet, the language, it whispers from the past. Hungarian or Magyar is a Uralic tongue. Same family as Finnish, same ancestral branches, same ghostly roots stretching back to a frozen forest on the edge of Yakutia. But the people? They're genetically Central European. Modern Hungarians, according to genome-wide studies, resemble Austrians, Slavs and Germans, not Yakuts, not Finns, not Saami. So how is the language still alive? It's likely that Uralic spread to the Magyars through a chain of linguistic adoption, Volga Finnic intermediaries perhaps, maybe merchants, maybe political alliances, maybe just wanderers carrying songs between rivers. By the time the Magyar tribes rode into the Carpathian Basin in the 9th century, they weren't Siberians anymore. They'd left those genes behind, but carried the grammar in their saddlebags. Today, Hungary is the furthest west any Uralic language has travelled. A lone voice on the edge of Europe, surrounded by Indo-European nations, yet still singing in the old tongue. It's a final contradiction, because language isn't just biology. It isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about memory. Sometimes it's about what refuses to die. If you're fascinated by lost histories and ancient DNA mysteries, subscribe for more untold stories. We're just getting started, because in our next episode, we follow the icy trail back east to uncover what binds the Sami of Lapland to the Ob-Ugrich herders of Siberia.